Tonight's story is called The Grave Gives Up by Jack Darcy. It was a melancholy night. Dampness impregnated the sultry autumn air. The light of the moon filtered faintly through a huge black cloud that hung over the face of the heavens. Somewhere from the great swamp near the graveyard, a whippoorwill sobbed, and the throbbing sound echoed the anguish in the heart of Gordon Lane. Gordon sat alone in his small bachelor apartment in the eastern end of the town. A fire crackled on the hearth, and a book lay upon his lap. Yet he could not see the type for the tears that dimmed his vision. For 2 weeks now, Gordon Lane had seen none of his friends. Mechanically, he had gone about his daily duties with that numbing pain in his heart that pumped a deadly emotional opiate to his brain. Once he had sworn that he could not live without Janice, and she had laughed at him. Now he knew that his words were not mere lover's rhetoric. Since that awful day a fortnight ago, something within him had died. When Janice had been killed in the automobile accident, the very soul of Gordon Lane had been slain right along with her. The overwhelming love that he had borne her had evolved into a great sorrow which gnawed like the Spartan fox at his heart. Despite the heat of the fire, Gordon shuddered as he thought of Janice's slim white body lying in the coldness of the dank earth. Within his breast he could feel that coldness as surely as if he had been lying in the grave with her. Within his brain was a deadness, a lifelessness, as if his body, too, was interred in a mossy stone script on the other side of town. And if Death himself had entered the room at that moment, he would have been a welcome visitor to Gordon Lane. For the first time in a week, the phone bell jangled. Lane did not stir at its metallic summons. Again and again it shrilled until it finally hammered into his consciousness. He turned slowly to the table at his side and lifted up the instrument. In a dull, listless voice, he said, "Hello?" Sound came over the wire as if from a great distance. He was very tired and dispirited as a weary breeze that stirred sere autumn leaves. Yet the words it uttered crashed in Elaine's ear like a thunderclap. "Gordon! Is that you, Gordon?" Lane's pulse leaped. For the first time since the funeral, his heart pumped, surging vibrant life through his veins. But what slew his lethargy was a stimulating toxin of stark terror. Like a fluttering kite, it rose in his pulse. Like the wings of a black bat, it beat against his brain. "Gordon! Gordon! Gordon! Are you there? Gordon!" But that voice that had come to him over the wire was the voice of Janice. Lane's hand was hot as he clutched the phone to his breast. His face was white, and there was a tremor in his tone as he answered. "Yes, this is Gordon. Janice? Janice, where are you? Where?" Again Lane heard the voice of the woman he had loved more than life itself, and it seemed to come from a distance as if it had been projected from the borderland of the netherworld from which no man has ever returned. "Gordon? Gordon?" For an instant, the dreariness left her tone and her words came pantingly like a hot wind over hell. "Gordon, come to me. I need you. I need you. I... The next syllable was an inarticulate, strangled fragment in her throat. From somewhere in the realm of infinity, Lane heard a stifled scream. A scream that caused the black bat in his brain to beat its dark wings more furiously. And then there was silence. "Janice!" Lane rasped her name into the mouthpiece. "Janice!" But there was no answer. If that voice had come from the grave, it had returned to its awful prison once more. If, for a fleeting moment, the other world had opened its locked doors, well, they were sealed again now. The complete silence of the receiver seemed to mock Gordon Lane. Gordon dropped the telephone upon the table and fell into his chair. Diamonds of sweat were on his brow now. His face, far whiter than the glacial snows, was painted ghastly, hellish red by the licking flames of the fire. He resembled a phantom before the gates of hell. Two facts seared themselves into Gordon's throbbing brain. He had heard her voice, and she was dead. For a long time, he stared into the fire as if in those flickering yellow tongues he would read the awful mystery which confronted him. Was it madness that assailed him? Had the burden of grief he had borne for the past 2 weeks caused a delicate hairline between sanity and madness to break? Was the phone call an illusion which existed only in his own tortured mind? Well, two distinct fears met and clashed within him. Fear for his own sanity and fear that he had for a moment communicated with that unknown, uncharted world beyond the grave. Slowly, Gordon's mind began to function logically through the maelstrom in his head. Slowly, his thoughts became translated to action. He moved toward the telephone. He picked it up with trembling fingers. A moment later, the operator's voice was in his ear. Operator. He made a desperate effort to make his tone casual. This is Gordon Lane of the county attorney's office. I believe my phone rang a few moments ago. Have you a record of the call? There was a moment's silence. Yes, sir. You were called at 9:16. We have the record here, sir. Lane could feel his heart pound up against his breast like a pendulum weighted with ice. And can you tell me where the call originated? Again, there was a short silence, a heavy, ominous silence in which shadowy phantoms bred in Lane's mind. Then the operator's voice rasped on the wires again. Why, yes, Mr. Lane. That call was made from 181 Lenora Street. Lane's hands gripped the phone with all his strength. It was as if he had to cling to something material, to anchor himself against the terrifying nebula of his thoughts. 181 Lenora, he said in his voice as dry as cactus stalk. That's the Gaunt Hill Cemetery. That is correct. There was a dull click at the other end of the wire as the operator broke the connection. But Gordon Lane did not replace the phone immediately. His hot, perspiring hand held the receiver clutched hard against his breast as if it was an aegis against the incredible thing which he must now believe. Janice had called him. It had been her voice, and the call had come from Gaunt Hill on the other side of town. Gaunt Hill, where Janice's lovely, tender body lay buried in a cold marble crypt. 20 minutes later, Lane's coupe slithered to a halt before a rectangular two-story building. His nervous finger jerked against a bell in the doorway. An immaculate butler opened the door. Dr. Ramos, said Lane pantingly. Is Dr. Ramos in? Hello, Lane, a voice greeted him from the foyer. The doctor, wearing his hat and coat, had spoke. I was just going out. What can I do for you, Mr. Lane? Lane crossed the threshold. His eyes were brilliant with a shining fever. His hair was rumpled and his face was a dirty ashen gray. As he spoke, his voice was hoarse and thick with feeling. I've got to see you a moment. At once. Privately. Ramos regarded him with a professional eye. Then quietly he replaced his hat on the hall tree. All right. Come into my office. He led the way to a book-lined sanctuary and took a seat beside his desk. Lane threw himself in a huge overstuffed chair and stared with glassy eyes at the doctor. Already he felt somewhat better, for the doctor symbolized everything that was reasonable. Ruddy-faced and solid, he held the respect of the ancient town. He was firmly opposed to all that might even be suspected of mysticism. He was a complete atheist, a crass materialist, fond of good food and better wines. If anyone in town could explain away the mad thing that had happened to Lane that night, that man was Dr. Ramos. Lane's white knuckles gripped the sides of the chair. Listen, doctor, it's It's about Janice. Ramos raised his eyebrows. Janice. Ah. Now listen, Lane. You've got to steady yourself on that score. Death comes to us all. You've got to get a hold of yourself. Wait a minute, doctor. It's not that. It's ah, you. You signed her death certificate, did you not? Ramos's eyes narrowed. A peculiar expression was on his face as he nodded at the younger man. Well, went on Lane, there was a terrible tenseness in his voice. Was was she in fact dead? Are you sure that she was really dead? Are you sure? He had risen from his chair, and now he pounded excitedly on the smooth top of the desk. Ramos made no reply until Lane's outburst had exhausted itself in a fit of words. My boy, he said at last, in a grave, sympathetic voice. I know what suffering must have gone on in your heart, but you must fight it with your reason. You must. Janice is dead. I saw her dead. You saw her interred. There can be no doubt about it, Lane. Yes. Then, said Lane, and his voice was the voice of a man who fears the words he speaks. How did she speak to me tonight? Where did her voice come from if she is dead? Is my ear so attuned that I can hear a voice from beyond? A shadow, almost imperceptible, flickered into the doctor's eyes. The ruddiness of his face grew a shade lighter. He leaned forward in his chair. What's that you say? You heard her voice? From the grave, doctor. I heard it. She telephoned me, said she needed me, and the call came from Gaunt Hill Cemetery. Dr. Ramos's face was dark for a fleeting instant. And then it became normal again. He rose and he crossed the room. He flung a fraternal arm about Lane's shoulder. My boy, there's a simple explanation. You would have thought of yourself if you hadn't been so overwrought. It's a joke. A cruel, practical joke, to be sure. Played by someone feeling fool who is trying to frighten you. Janice died here in my sanitarium, Gordon. Of that I can assure you. Here, I'll give you a sedative. You take it and you go to bed. Gordon Lane came to his feet. It seemed that in that single instant, the cobwebs of fear had been brushed from his brain. There was something within him that was stronger than the terror that held him in its icy thrall. Something stronger than any other emotion he had ever experienced. And now, that thing was clear at last. Now Gordon knew where his duty lay. Now he knew what he must do. No. No, he said, his voice was resolute. I want no sedative. No matter what hideous thing is behind that call tonight, I know that it was the voice of Janice, my Janice. I know further that she needs me. I shall go to her. She spoke to me from Gaunt Hill. That is all I know. So it is to Gaunt Hill that I must go. She needs me. He turned on his heel and strode toward the door. Ramos's voice, pitched oddly, came to him on the threshold. Wait a minute, Lane. Now don't be a fool. Janice is dead, I tell you. Don't go to Gaunt Hill tonight. As Lane turned to face the doctor, it seemed to him that there was a cloud of apprehension in Dr. Ramos's eyes. I'm going, doctor. Now. Ramos crossed the room and stood in the doorway facing Lane. He put his hands on the younger man's shoulders and gazed squarely into his eyes. An odd sensation came over Lane in that moment. He could feel the blood mount to his face, feel its swift rhythmic beat in his temples. Don't go to Gaunt Hill tonight, said Ramos, speaking each word in a measured, spondy beat. Don't go. Again, Lane was aware of that odd, lulling throb in his temples, but the knowledge of Janice's need was a strong, impelling force at his breast. Roughly, he took the doctor's hands from his shoulders. I must go. He strode past the other, through the hall and out of the sanitarium. A moment later, his coupe raced, a shadowy phantom through the deserted streets. It sped, a ghostly vehicle through the town, toward the marshy swamp on whose sloping bank reposed the city of the dead, the Gaunt Hill Cemetery. The tombstones were white, motionless specters in the night. Overhead, the stark leafless branches of the trees waved in the breeze like the naked arms of some black Lorelei beckoning to disaster. The lethal silence which hung over the graveyard was not the silence which occurs through mere lack of sound. No. Rather, this was a positive thing, a throbbing silence which assailed the senses as surely as the beat of savage drums. On the right, near the entrance, a squat building loomed against the faint clouded moonlight. That, Lane knew, was a caretaker's lodge. No light shone in its windows. Lane walked past the place on quiet feet. He had no wish to disturb the man at this hour. He realized the explanation for his presence here would sound ridiculous in another's ears. As he moved noiselessly through the steels, it seemed as if the directing portion of his brain was a detached part of him. Quite clearly he knew what he must do. He walked directly toward the Lansing mausoleum where Janice was buried. Dead or not dead, whether she were in her crypt, whether she were in hell or in heaven, she had said she needed him, and he had come. Yet despite his grim resolve, despite his firm purpose, he was not entirely unafraid. That uncanny telephone call had pricked his delicate nervous system with a pin of fear, and now in this ancient graveyard that had spread its earthy cloak over decayed corpses since the days of the Spaniards, there was an eerie, electric atmosphere. What it was, Gordon did not know. Normally he had not the weak man's fear of death and dead things. But here tonight he felt that some intangible horror stalked him, that some invisible monster strode at his side. He started for a moment as he saw a black rectangular shape rise from a tombstone, flap black wings, and fly off in the face of the moon. An involuntary shudder ran through his body, for at that moment it seemed as if the bat presaged some dire happening, as if it were a forerunner of the evil thing that was destined to happen. On his left, some 40 feet this side of the Lansing tomb, stood a square marble edifice. Lane recognized it as a burying place of the Cervantes family, that old clan of the town who could trace their ancestry back to the brave days of Balboa. Then, abruptly, he halted. A sound. A single sound had broken that deathly silence. A faint creaking noise had reached his eardrums, and it had come from the tomb of the Cervantes. For a long moment Gordon Lane stood motionless, but inside him there was no stillness. Fear swirled like a misty cloud within his heart. The vague apprehension that had been with him suddenly crystallized into a definite horror that the unknown thing which he had feared was at last imminent. Again he heard the creaking sound. Long drawn out and undulating, it crawled into his hearing. Then it ended, punctuated by a lower note like the grunt of a wallowing swine. Oink. Gordon Lane's will held him where he was, held him firmly from the obeying all his screaming instincts to run from this place of evil. His face was white and his eyes shone a mighty resolve as he deliberately turned his face toward the tomb. His hand reached out and touched the handle of the crypt door. His fingers were colder than the metal which they clasped. He turned the handle. He pushed his weight against that massive oaken door. Slowly it swung inward. The darkness that poured into his eyes was almost a material thing. Dank air seeped into his nostrils. The frightful odor of decaying flesh filtered into his lungs. His cold fingers groped in his vest pocket and found a package of matches. Then as he was about to strike the match, he heard a sigh. A human sigh. was a weary, discouraged exhalation like the last whisper of a damned soul. With effort, Lane held his fingers steady as he struck the match. The tiny light flared easily and eerily in that chamber. Ghostly flickering shadows danced on the damp stone walls as the little flame burned unevenly. Lane's eyeballs pained him as he stared strainingly into the gloom. The walls were lined with coffins of ancient wood. A rat scurried across the floor at his feet. The match burned low and seared his fingers. Hastily he lit another. Then as he stood there, holding that tiny, inadequate light in his hand, he felt a cold snake of terror crawl along his spine. Wings of panic beat in his brain. His eyes stared straight ahead of him, and in their depth was a glazed expression of fearful doubt as if he trembled to believe the thing he saw. For directly opposite him, the lid of a coffin was rising. The rotted, dust-covered wood made an odd creaking sound as it moved, a sound like an off-key note struck on a ghostly violin. And then as it lifted higher, Lane saw the hand that was moving it. It was a gray and bony hand with long prehensile fingers. Tightly, they clasped the edge of the coffin lid and thrust it upward. And then an arm appeared, a tenuous, naked arm like the ashen tentacle of some fiendish octopus. Lane's eyes dropped from the ghastly sight for a moment and focused upon the tarnished silver nameplate of the coffin. Then as the words engraved there registered on his mind, a white madness froze his nerves. For the man who was rising from the tomb had been dead for over 100 years. The creaking noise increased. Wildly, Lane glanced about him. On all sides, the lids were moving. Thin, emaciated arms appeared pushing up the covers which sealed the corpses in their tombs. Verily, the grave was yielding up its dead. It was no longer the human concept of fear that coursed through Lane's arteries. It was now an overwhelming dread, that awful paralyzing force which deluges man when he witnesses the violation of all natural law, of all the things that he has been taught to believe. The dead were rising up around him. The dead, who never returned, were rising from their coffins, coming back to an earthly sphere. They were bursting the inviolate bonds of the grave, shattering all natural laws in one unholy manifestation. Gordon's heart cried, "Flee!" His brain reeled dazedly before the incredible sight he witnessed. But his muscles were beyond his control. Some unseen vice held his sinews in mighty thrall. His legs were rooted to the spot where he stood. Again the match burned his finger. His shaking hands essayed to light another, for darkness redoubled the terror of the tomb. Again the match flickered to a jerky light. Glassy eyes stared at Lane. The lifeless gaze of the dead stared at the intruder who had been blasphemed their tomb with his very presence. Their faces were horrible things over which the white hand of death had passed, leaving its indelible mark. They were blank, expressionless faces, devoid of all intelligence, sans all life and animation. Gaunt, bony chests thrust themselves from the filthy, ragged shreds which hung about their unearthly shoulders. But their eyes held the most awful thing of all. They were the eyes of men who have gazed upon the unholy mysteries of the netherworld, eyes which have traveled across the Styx itself and witnessed the iniquitous evil on the banks of hell. Behind all this lay an insufferable pain, an agony of the soul which even death's great power had been unable to release. Lane never knew how long he stood there, exchanging scrutiny with these things that had climbed back from the abyss. It seemed that infinity ticked past, and the muscles of his body remained completely beyond his control. And then came the thing that broke the paralysis. A scream ripped through the air, a scream pregnant with terror and agony, and despite its unnaturally high-pitched tone, Gordon recognized the voice. Janice. That single fact smashed into his numbed consciousness of the force that precluded all else. The blood surged through his arteries once more. Yes, for the love of God. He flung the burning match to the floor. He spun round on his heel and raced like one possessed from the dank interior of this frenzied vault of death. The cool, fresh air of the night hit his face like a wave of cold water. As he ran, he once again heard that awful scream hammer with the dreadful force through that fetid atmosphere of the graveyard. He changed his direction slightly. Now he knew whence that scream came. It had emanated from the Lansing crypt. There was no doubt of that. Despite the terrific strain under which he was laboring, relief pumped into his heart. If that voice was Janice's, and he knew it was, she was alive. Alive! She had returned from the tomb to him. He crashed up against the door of the mausoleum. The mausoleum! His trembling fingers found the handle and turned it. He raced into the tomb. Janice! Janice! There was no reply, save the mocking reverberations of his own voice hurled back at him by the stone walls of the vault. Once again he groped for his matches. He struck one and stared about him. There was no sign of life here. Death was indicated by the solid line of coffins which flanked the wall. Swiftly Lane walked about the cavernous chamber. Swiftly his eyes glanced at the silver nameplates on the coffins. Then at last he came to a halt at the rear of the room. Reposing on a marble slab lay a bier, and on the gleaming argent at its base was written the name of the woman that Gordon Lane had loved above life itself. He fell to his knees beside the coffin, murmuring her name. Then as his hands gripped the coffin lid to wrench it off, his match went out. Feverishly he struck another. He held it, flickering and dancing in his left hand while he jerked the lid up with his right. With a hollow thud, the cover fell back. Lane leaned forward, lowering his match. A vague relief had temporarily banished the dread he had felt. Janice had needed him. Even in death, she had needed him. And now he was here. Gordon bent lower over the bier, staring into the little pool of light cast by the match. Slowly his eyes dilated. Slowly the old fear seeped back into his veins. Slowly he became conscious once again of the gnawing horror inside him. For the coffin was empty. Gordon Lane let the match go out then. He stood there in the thick darkness. Was this madness that assailed him? Had he taken leave of his normal physical world and through some unholy device been transported to a realm of evil paradox? Janice was not there. Janice had broken her tomb, had slashed through the fetters of death, even as those ghastly things in the crypt of Cervantes had. What unearthly things were happening here? Was this a case for the blue-uniformed officer of the police? Or rather the black-robed servant of the church? Then Gordon moved. He strode swiftly toward the still open door of the vault. If a few moments ago he had taken care to avoid the keeper of the cemetery, well, he was seeking him now. Perhaps the caretaker could clear up this ghastly mystery of the night. He raced from the tomb. He headed toward the distant gate of the graveyard. With his fists, Gordon hammered on the wooden door of the lodge. After a while he heard a creaking footstep within the building, and the door opened. An old man in pajamas stood upon the threshold. A pair of gray, rheumy eyes stared at Lane. A twisted, distorted mouth snarled at him. "Why do you wake me at this hour? Are you a ghoul? Are you? Huh?" "No, no," cried Lane. "But there's hell abroad in this cemetery. Dead men are walking, dead men are rising from their tombs, and a girl is missing, gone from the Lansing crypt." Then something flickered in the old man's eyes. Something evil and calculating. A frown corrugated his brow, then he stepped aside. "Oh, come in." His voice was soft, slimy. "Come in. Perhaps we should telephone the police, Come in. Come in." He stepped aside, and Lane entered the house. A telephone stood on the table near the window. The old man indicated it. Go on. Go on. Call. If there's evil here, we too cannot cope with it. Call the police." Lane nodded. This, of course, was the sane thing to do. Supernatural or human, the pair of them could not cope with the terrifying forces which had been unleashed this night. He picked up the receiver. He did not see the expression of sadistic triumph which had crawled into the old man's eyes. He did not see the contorted, gray, feral lips as the caretaker took a step toward him. He did not see the solid metal object that the old man held firmly in his right hand. Oh, true. He heard the faint hissing sound as the blackjack hurtled down through the air toward his temple. Ah, yes, but then it was too late, wasn't it? The club smashed hard against Gordon's skull. A streak of dancing light flashed across his vision. Then blackness seeped in. Total blackness that was even darker than the sable atmosphere of the tomb where he had seen the grave give up its dead. Gordon Lane had no way of knowing how much later he opened his eyes. Directly above him, a grotesque shadow danced on a rocky ceiling. Gordon Lane had no way of knowing how much later he opened his eyes. Directly above him, a grotesque shadow danced on a rocky ceiling. His head throbbed achingly. With an effort, he raised his head and looked about him. He blinked dully as he stared at the uncanny scene which met his eyes then. His first thought was that he had been struck down by the Reaper's scythe, and that he now lay in some dank tomb of his own in the underworld. The rocky chamber was illuminated by a score of candles, which cast their unsteady light dispiritedly into the room. Far over to the left, a half a dozen creatures worked with pick and shovel. They moved in their task like robots. Their thin arms swung mechanically through the air as they dug. No expression was on their drawn faces. As Lane stared at them, he inhaled sibilantly as he realized what they were. They were the things he had seen resurrected from the Cervantes' tomb. Zombies. Snatched by some unholy hand from their surcease of the grave to slave for some iniquitous force, Lane felt the skin on the back of his neck tighten. Then he was aware of an ugly chuckle behind him. Slowly, he turned his aching head, and there, standing directly over him, was the caretaker of the cemetery. His face was a twisted, ugly thing, and in his hand the naked blade of a knife gleamed eerily in the flickering light of candles. Lane looked at him and beyond him. Needles seemed to prick his eyeballs. His throat was suddenly dry. His heart stood still. For there, at the other end of the cavern, clad in a single diaphanous garment, was Janice Lansing. Unsteadily, Lane got to his feet. "Janice!" he cried. His voice was like a hollow echo in the rocky room. "Janice!" But she did not look at him. Her usual vivacious, lovely face was drab and blank. Her eyes were turned toward a dark-garbed figure who sat some little distance from her. Her full red lips were drawn thin and taut across her teeth, and in her eyes was a gleam of ineffable anguish. Shocked by her appearance, Lane cried out again, "Janice! Janice! It's Gordon! Janice! Can't you hear me?" For a long moment there was a tense silence, broken only by the metallic clang of pick and shovel against the shale-filled earth. Then through the chamber there was a sound of a voice which was vaguely familiar to Gordon Lane's ears, yet which somehow seemed to hold a malignant threat. "No, you fool! She cannot see you! She cannot... She can only see what I will her to see. But you, you shall see death before another dawn. You were warned not to come here tonight." Lane lifted his eyes. He stared through the murkiness of the chamber. Slowly the figure was lying before him. Then his recognition dawned. He uttered a gasp of utter astonishment, for the speaker was Dr. Ramos. Yes, it was not the Ramos that Lane had once known. The bluff readiness of the man's face now seemed to be the crimson stain of blood. The hearty, solid voice he had lost its affable tone, and now held an awful note of doom. The doctor's casual atheism, which the village had tolerated, suddenly became a fearful thing to Gordon Lane. It was a black unholiness, a defy to the very God who had created him. From the other side of the room, Lane noticed that the sounds of shoveling had ceased. He was aware of a low, animal-like rumble of voices. He turned his head to see the 6 emaciated things that had once been men, standing stock still, their tools in their hands. Their eyes were fixed on the dark figure of Dr. Ramos, and in the depth of their gaze was the most appalling menace of evil that Lane had ever seen. Ramos's flashing dark eyes turned to them. He fixed them with a satanic gaze. "You work, you dogs, work! You Cataran, work! Work!" The caretaker stepped forward. He thrust his knife in his belt and snatched up a crimson-stained whip which lay on the rocky bottom of the cavern. The doctor's eyes were still fixed, glittering obsidian marbles, upon the creatures that had crawled from their tombs. Cataran lifted the whip. Its rawhide sang a bitter zirlate through the air. The lash bit deep into the flesh. Blood, black and terrible, streaked down the cadaver's body and ran under the fresh earth. The man opened his ashen lips and his vocal cords vibrated a terrible cry of affliction. Yet, Lane noted, the thing made no move to attack its torturer. The others seized their tools and resumed their arduous labor. The flicker of life which had registered on their faces a moment ago was gone now. They had returned to the lifeless life which seemed to hold them in its awful thrall. Gordon Lane was frozen with horror. Janice, too, must be held fast in its overwhelming power of Ramos. She had not even glanced at him, Gordon. Her eyes were fastened to the dark figure of the doctor who sat upon a shelf of rock, for all the world like some wicked monarch surveying his wretched subjects. "That'll do, Cataran," said Ramos. "Let them work. There's much to be done tonight. This shall be our night of nights. The treasure we've recovered thus far will be as nothing if we can't find the Grail. It must be here. We've searched everywhere else that I can think of. We must find the Grail." Lane turned to Ramos. No longer could he control the potent wrath that welled within him as he gazed at Janice. He rushed toward the doctor. "You swine!" he roared, and the echoes of his anger filled the catacomb. "What have you done? What evil thing have you wrought? Curse you! Lift your evil spell off Janice, or I'll tear you to pieces with my own hands." Ramos smiled evilly as he looked down on him. Even as he finished the sentence, Lane was aware of the cold steel of Cataran's blade pressed against the flesh of his neck. "You are a fool. You have blundered in here. You shall never blunder out. You know too much. Your girl knew too much. That is why she is here. That is why my spell is upon her." He indicated the laboring creatures with a wave of his hand. "Those," he contemptuously said, "shall die too, when I am done with them. They mean little. I needed bodies for my work. I took them. But Janice pried into my affairs. She shall never do that again. When I am finished with her, when her beauty tires me, she, too, shall join those creatures in the grave once more." Despite the threat of the knife at his jugular, Gordon Lane hammered against the rock with impotent fists. "In God's name, man!" Ramos rose from his seat. It was as if the devil himself had etched the expression on his face. "God!" And the single syllable was all hate, all the contempt and loathing that a voice can muster, and in his eyes there crawled a look that had been born in the eyes of Lucifer on the day he had damned his master. "God!" said Ramos again. Then he spoke rapidly and terribly. A torrent of horrible blasphemy poured from his bitter lips. Words evil and ugly as a black mass poured in Lane's shocked ears. "God," said Ramos, "what has your God done for me? On my distaff side, my people were Indians, Incas. The men of the Christian God slew them, slaughtered them, robbed them. I curse him, and from him I take back what is rightfully mine, the treasures he has taken from me." Panting, he resumed his seat. His eyes fell upon the graven image of lifeless beauty at his side. Then a smile crept across his mouth, a ghastly, ugly smile. "You shall die, Lane," he said more quietly, "and it is fitting that you die by Janice's own hand. Because of her love for you, I have been unable to control her will completely. There is some deeper emotion for you within her that thwarts me. But in time I shall shatter it, and she shall be mine, all mine."
Then you are dead. The power within her that withstands me shall crumble. I shall have your girl, Lane, and she shall slay you with her own hands. She shall drive a knife through your heart. He turned to the girl and thrust a dirk into her slim hand. Janice, he said.
A wave of jealousy and loathing rippled through Gordon Lane's body as he saw how completely submissive the girl was to the beast in whose thrall she was inexorably held. Yet a flicker of hope went through him. She still loved him, and that love had kept her from submitting entirely to the mad doctor. The depth of that love had resisted his black arts.
Janice,
said Ramos again, and the quiet menace in his tone was more threatening than his roaring demands of a moment ago.
Janice, you will take that dirk. You will plunge it into the heart of that man. There.
He pointed a finger at Lane, and for the first time since he had come to his chamber, Janice looked at him.
You will slay him,
said Ramos again.
Because you hate him. You loathe him. You shall kill him. Cateran, stand back.
The caretaker's voice rose in protest.
He'll overpower her. He said with a cracked, hysterical tone. I shall slash with my knife. Two. Stand back, you fool. It is not her strength he is using. Stand back.
Cateran stood back. His knife's blade no longer touched the flesh of Lane's neck, and now Janice advanced upon him. At that moment, Gordon Lane knew that he would rather have gazed into the heart of hell itself than behold the sight which he confronted then. The woman he had loved, beyond all else, had metamorphosed into a snarling, savage beast. Her beauty had evolved into a satanic evil thing. Hate and loathing were in her face as she approached to slay the man she had once pledged to love until death. Until death. The phrase struck Lane's mind ironically. Perhaps she had obeyed that vow literally. Perhaps she was now beyond death, and she had come from the grave to slay, to kill. Oh, how he wished he had put down that seat. Slowly she came toward him. Lane took a step forward and stretched out his arms. Janice, he said, a suppliant appeal in his tone. Janice, it's Gordon. You must know me. For a moment he seemed to him that Janice wavered in her death-dealing march. But then Ramos's voice cracked like an icy whip through the room.
Slay him. Slay the thing you hate.
Lane essayed to catch the girl's eye, yet even when their gazes met, no sign of recognition shone in her face. Closer and closer she came, like a crazed tigress stalking her prey. Then in an instant she was upon him. Lane had no desire to harm her. It seemed a simple matter to take the weapon away from this fragile girl. Why Ramos had permitted this farce to begin, he did not understand. He reached out his hand to take the dirk from her slim hand as easily as possible. And then a moment later he was fighting with all his strength for his very life. The thing that grappled with him was not Janice Lansing. It was possessed of the strength of a terrible fiend. Lane seized her right wrist in his hand. Her left clawed like a beast, talon at his face, and blood streaked in rivulets down his chin. Never had woman been born who possessed such terrible strength. And then as Lane glanced over her shoulder, he saw the countenance of the doctor. It was taut, dripping with sweat as if the man was undergoing some awful strain. And then in an instant, the significance of Ramos's words came to him. It is not her strength she is using. Dear God, it was not her own strength. It was Ramos's. In a blazing flash, Lane understood part of the enigma. Janice was held fast in the invisible tentacles of Ramos's mind. Lane had heard of the doctor's proficiency at hypnotism, mesmerism. Janice was at the complete mercy of Ramos's brain, and somehow, through some devilish refinement of the mesmerism, he was pouring his own strength into her body. Desperately, Lane grappled with the girl. The power of an Amazon was in her arms. He could feel her hot breath on his face. He could see the bared teeth as she snarled at him. And all the while, her terrible might was bringing her arm down, bringing that gleaming blade closer to his heart. Sweat, cold and glistening as drops of ice, stood in Gordon Lane's brow. The demoniac power which the girl derived from the evil force in Ramos's head drove the knife down closer and closer to his body. Lane leaned his face over toward the girl and spoke to her softly. Janice. Janice.
This is Gordon. Gordon, who loves you, Janice. You must remember.
There was a pleading agony in his tone. Their eyes met. It seemed to him that for an infinitesimal fraction of a second the driving force of her arm abated. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw a glimmer of intelligence and recognition in her eyes. It was then that he made his move. Beyond her, the veins were standing out on the doctor's forehead. He seemed under a great strain. Lane's hand tightened on the girl's wrist, wrenched it hard. He brought up his right and seized the hilt of the dirk. Then he snatched it from her. He thrust her away from him and took a step backward. Cataran's cry of alarm echoed through staccato through the catacombs. In an instant, Ramos rose to his feet. His hand dropped to his coat pocket. The flickering candlelight danced crazily in the blue steel barrel of the revolver he jerked up from his coat. The revolver came up to aim directly at Lane's heart. But Gordon Lane did not hesitate. With a serpent-like movement, he drew back his arm. Then he hurled it forward with all his strength. The dirk hurtled through the air. Even as Ramos's revolver spoke, the blade ate its way avidly into his shoulder. The doctor uttered a cry of pain and stumbled forward. His foot slipped and he fell with a crash. Janice Lansing fell forward into Lane's arms. Then Lane heard a slithering footfall at his side. Grinning evilly, Cataran approached with his own blade, prepared to slay. Lane sidestepped, swinging the girl around. Then his light lashed out. It cracked with a sickening sound on the point of the other's jaw. Cataran dropped to the floor. Tightly, Gordon held the girl in his arms. Now she looked up at him, wonder and bewilderment in her face.
Gordon, I knew you'd come. How did you find me? What had he done? Don't let him take me again, Gordon. Don't.
He won't, said Lane grimly, nor will he ever take them. Look. He indicated the 6 workmen. Since Ramos had fallen, it seemed that the spell which held them had broken too. Exhausted, they had fallen to the fresh earth they had dug. They stared at each other with wondering, bewildered eyes. For God's sake, cried Lane, why did he do this to you? A shudder ran through the girl's slim body.
For 2 reasons. First, he made violent love to me, and I refused him. Second, I learned his awful secret.
Lane indicated the prostrate, emaciated things which lay on their backs in the rear of the cavern. You mean the secret of that? She nodded.
It was when I was convalescing. He permitted no one to see me, telling people I was much worse than I was. That was when he was making love to me. Then one day I came upon him and Reeves, the undertaker, talking to Cataran. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, but after hearing the first few words, I had to listen to the rest.
She shivered as she glanced toward the exhausted creatures behind her.
They were patients of his over a period of time who had no immediate relatives or friends, or at least those people didn't care much what happened to them. He used to advertise in the weekly country papers offering to take care of indigent relatives. He treated them with a preparation of cannabis indica that stupefied them, rendered them their wills supine to his devilish hypnotism.
He must be mad.
I think he is. He boasted of all this to me when he warned me what he would do if I refused him. Reeves, the undertaker, would bury his dead, live men. Ramos would sign the death certificate. With his reputation in the town, there was no suspicion.
But what if these distant relatives had wanted to see the body laid out? What if I had not been out of town when you were supposed to have been at the undertaker's? If I had learned of your supposed death early enough to have viewed your body as well as attended the funeral?
Oh, he had all that worked out, too. You see, it was arranged that when Reeves laid out a corpse, he was to arrange the coffin so the body was completely covered. The head seen through thick glass was the only thing visible.
The drug reduced respiration.
The thick glass would also screen the almost imperceptible movement of the slow breathing. Of course, I was buried in the family vault with the others who took the places of the dead Cervantes whose bodies Ramos burned. When he put them into the coffins in the mornings, he would order them in their hypnotic spell to arise at a certain hour. They were so obedient to his will that they awoke and reported the catacombs ready for labor on the stroke of midnight.
Lane nodded. With Cataran in his pay, that would explain why the Cervantes tomb was unlocked, so that the dead men could get out. But, darling, why? For God's sake, why? Is the man merely mad that he did these incredible evil things?
Oh, I'm certain he's mad. If there was one completely sane motive for what he did. Ramos had always hated the church. Far back he was descended from the persecuted Incas. He hated Christianity. One day when cleaning out the Cervantes tomb, Cataran found an old map that revealed the treasure whereabouts of buried church treasures that the Spaniards had taken from the Indians 500 years ago. Ramos wanted them. Apparently they were worth a great deal of money, and they were buried in the catacombs of the graveyard. He dared not let anyone know, for then they would have become the property of the church. Neither his blasphemous views nor his cupidity would permit that. Those poor creatures were his laboring slaves. They dung at night for treasure. During the day they returned to their coffins, held there by Ramos's drug and hypnosis. He did the same thing to me, fighting to dominate me completely. But tonight, your phone call, I suddenly awoke in my coffin. For a short while I was in complete possession of my faculties. He had always had more trouble keeping the spell on me than he did with the others.
Lean's arm tightened about her shoulder, and I know why.
Anyway, I ran from the crypt. I ran to Cataran's house and I phoned you. Cataran found me and dragged me away.
She lifted her eyes, glanced across the room, and uttered a little moan.
Look, he moved. He's not dead.
No, but after this, he'll be where he can do you no harm. She clung to him.
Oh, Gordon, I'm afraid. I shall always be afraid while he's alive. To know that someone can have such power over me.
For a long moment, they held each other. Then Gordon Lane knew what he must do. Darling, go to Cataran's cottage. Phone the police. Bring them here at once. I'll wait here and keep guard. Hurry, darling. She smiled at him bravely and ran out of the dark, dank catacomb. Lane glanced around the room. The 6 emaciated things lay almost unconscious on the ground. Perhaps they would live. Perhaps they would pay with their lives for the ghastly thing that Ramos had done to them. Cataran lay motionless on the floor. Ramos stirred uneasily. Lane crossed the room, picked up the revolver that the doctor had dropped. In his head there burned Janice's words. I shall always be afraid while he lives. Gordon Lane bent down over the prostrate figure of the fiend and leveled the gun. There was no compunction in his heart as he sent 2 bullets crashing into Ramos's diseased brain.